Well, good morning. I'm so proud to be here. As Elaine said, I direct the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. And one of the things that I am honored to be a part of is the Cook Leadership Academy there at the Hauenstein Center. It's an academy of 40 college students in any given time, and we study leaders, and we get people out in leadership roles. And so it is a wonderful opportunity this morning to be with you, to be with somebody who has had such high-quality leadership experience and somebody who has great perspectives on leadership herself. What I would like to do this morning in this first part of the program is introduce 4 of the students from the Cook Leadership Academy at the Hauenstein Center, and they will each ask a question or two of Secretary Albright, and then after that part of the program, then we turn it over to you, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Albright. Okay? So with that, let me begin by introducing our 4 students at Grand Valley. I'd like to begin with Xinyi Yo, who is at the end there. She is a history, archaeology, and Middle Eastern studies major, and she was born and raised in Beijing, China. Then we also have with us Heidi McPheeters, who is next to Xinyi. Heidi is a social work, third world development, and nonprofit leadership graduate student at Grand Valley. Then we have Mike Cnossen, who's closest to me. He is a veteran, and he's majoring in international relations at Grand Valley. And fourth and finally, we have Darris Sawtelle, who is liberal studies, legal studies, and a philosophy major at Grand Valley on his way to law school. So these are the 4 people who have joined us. Let's give them a hand. When we were talking about questions to ask Dr. Albright, there were so many things, and the 4 of us, the 5 of us got together beforehand and talked about the questions. I think we want to start with the more general biographical questions and then move slowly into more of the policy questions. So that's a principle of organization here. And Xinyi, I think you have a good question to start with.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Albright. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have a question pertaining to something you mentioned early on in your memoir. I couldn't believe it when you said that in high school you were somewhat of a permanent wallflower. And so now, as an accomplished woman and diplomat, I was wondering what advice you would give to these middle school and high school students here today.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to thank Elaine for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. I actually was coming back from China not long ago, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady ahead of me said, "Where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." And I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then it was going through the magnetometers, and the TSA guard looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're always welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you?" So we stopped the whole line, have a picture taken, and I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State," and she said, "Of Bosnia?" So, well, I think, first of all, life isn't all high school, thank goodness. There are many different things that happen, and I think that what I was very shy, and also part of my problem was I was born in Europe, and I came. This is me making this echo sound. We came to the United States when I was 11 years old, and all I wanted to do was to blend in and be just a typical American teenager, which was not simple given my parents, because blending in, my mother was this really delightful nut, and she read palms at dinner parties and would predict the craziest things to people, always embarrassing. And then my father wanted to fit in Colorado, which in Colorado meant fishing. The only problem was that he went fishing in a coat and tie. And then when I went out on dates, he would always follow behind in the family car. and invite the boys in for milk and cookies. So I didn't have a lot of second dates until I got to college. So not a simple issue. But I do think that, I think it is me making this terrible sound. Why don't I just hold it? No, you can't hear me. So I think that the advice I would give is to, especially in high school, to learn who you are and try to figure out who you want to be. And then I think really decide the things that interest you and learn to speak up. And also, this is a hard thing to say to all of you, is to be a judge of yourself and not always allow your peers to make the judgments about who you are and who you're going to be. Because life changes, and so you have to develop kind of a sense of yourself and figure out how you want to operate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albright.
Heidi?
Yeah, Dr. Albright, it's an honor to meet you. As a woman that grew up during a time when expectations for women weren't great, which leaders influenced and inspired you in your career pursuits that didn't really develop until later in life?
Well, I really, I went to college at some point between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. So things were very, very different. I did go to a women's college at Wellesley, and what's interesting is because it is a women's college, I think that many of the professors were women, and a lot of role models kind of came from there. And you know, as a woman, you always have to say Eleanor Roosevelt was a role model, but I didn't know Eleanor Roosevelt, and so in many ways, a lot of my role models were men, and people that had been involved in politics, and people that kind of combined knowledge with political action. Lane was talking about Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was my professor at Columbia, very smart, and by the way, I have to tell this, when he became National Security Advisor, at that stage, I was working for Senator Muskie as his chief legislative assistant, and he called up and he said, Madeleine, perhaps you've heard I've become National Security Advisor. I said, yes, I've read that. And he said, I'm calling to ask you to find me a place to live. And I said, geez, Big, I thought you were calling to offer me a job. And he said, no, I'm calling to ask you to find me a place to live. And so only 2 years later did he actually offer me a job. But I do think that my role models were a lot of my professors at Wellesley and my father, who had been a Czechoslovak diplomat and then became a professor. So many of the ways that he lived his life, the history that he learned, how he used history to inform his teaching. Those were the kinds of things. But you were saying how hard. Let me just tell you something interesting. I wanted to be a journalist. And I was one of the editors of my college paper. I then married a journalist. I worked on a small newspaper in Rolla, Missouri, while he was in the Army. And then we were in Chicago, where I was going to find a job, and we were having dinner with his managing editor. And he said, so what are you going to do, honey? And I said, I'm going to work on a newspaper. And he said, I don't think so. You can't work on the same paper as your husband because of guild regulations, and you wouldn't want to work on one of the competing papers and compete with your husband. And instead of saying what you might say or what I might say today, I actually saluted and kind of started a different life. So things were different. And I recently found something that I'd written. I got married 3 days after graduating from college and had twins 2 years later. I was 24 years old. And I was with my premature twins, and I wrote something and said, I've gotten a great college degree, but the only thing that I am capable of doing is being a typist. And so it was a very different era, I think, in terms of what people expected of women, even though I had gone to a terrific women's college.
Yeah. Mike? Well, Dr. Albright, thank you for spending so much time with us in Grand Rapids and coming up here. My question was more towards current affairs and foreign affairs. There are a lot of risks involved with supporting democracy abroad. For example, with the Arab Spring, I was wondering, how can the U.S. support its belief in democracy while also balancing it with its national security interest. How do you balance those two ideals?
Well, first of all, thank you for your service. And where did you serve?
I did a tour in Afghanistan.
Yeah. I can't thank you enough, and I think we all owe you a great debt of gratitude. And by the way, I have been very fascinated about veterans going back to school. And at Georgetown, what happened, I will answer your question, but I want to tell this, is that there was a student who'd come back, a veteran from Afghanistan, and he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post and said he was very glad to be back in school, but that he didn't really feel a part of it, and that and his relations with other students. So I found him, and I asked him to come and be in my class. And I do think that veterans, with your experience, add an incredible amount to other students in universities and colleges where you go. So I hope the others appreciate not only your service, but your presence now. I think that I happen to, looking at things from the perspective of an American decision maker and what it is that we want. And Americans, in many ways, we're a status quo power, but we believe that our national interests are better served when people in countries are satisfied, when there is a capability of having stability and countries being good partners to us, not problems for us. And so I think in the long run, one has the sense that people are better off when they're living under democracies, when they're able to make their own decisions. But we do know that democracy is a very long process. It's not an event, it's a process, and a difficult one. And there are often questions about, are we doing the right thing, just the way you've asked it in terms of promoting democracy. I am chairman of the board of a very interesting organization called the National Democratic Institute. It was actually an organization that was begun by President Reagan when in '83 he spoke in England and he said that democracies were not really good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. And he came back and he started the National Endowment for Democracy that has 4 institutes under it, Democrats and Republicans, business and labor. And so we've existed now for over 30 years, and it really has been very good in promoting democracy. You can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. And so the question is what we do. What is the problem? And one of the questions that one thinks about is Egypt, for instance. Was the United States better off when Egypt was run by an authoritarian leader, or is it better off now? And I think in the long run it will be better off as a democracy, but the intervening period is a very difficult one. And people say, well, why are you helping to disrupt a country? The bottom line is the United States does not do the disrupting of the country. The people that disagree with what's going on there are the ones that want a different form of government. And if the United States is supporting democracy development, it's mostly giving them the tools to be able to have real democracies. But it's a messy situation, very messy. And I think that we believe in our value system. We think people are better off if they can make decisions about their own lives. But democracy has to deliver because people want to vote and eat. And so it's a tough question.
Dr. Albright, in light of your father's influence on your life, and you seem to admire him so very much, what effect did that have on you, on your own career as a diplomat?
Well, first of all, when I was growing up, he was a diplomat. He was, right after World War II, he became ambassador to Yugoslavia, the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. And I think you've probably seen pictures of little girls at the airport in national costumes giving flowers. That's what I did for a living. And I met a lot of people at that stage. And it was interesting because we all lived in the embassy. And I was the firstborn. I also was the perfect daughter. And I had a very strict father. And so the influence initially was about studying hard, there's no question about that, and learning from history. And then I think very much watching his behavior in terms of coming to a new country, being very grateful for having been taken in by the Americans, and then I think translating his knowledge of history to active diplomacy. My father I think, really was a born teacher. And he did love to teach and teach me and his students. He was quite a popular professor, and he ultimately became dean of the Graduate School of International Affairs at the University of Denver, which is now named in his honor. But I have to tell the story about some of his students. So by the time he died in 1977, he was a really big deal, and there were flowers and tributes and all kinds of things in Denver. And among them was this ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with a bunch of leaves in it. And so I asked my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice. So she had, her parents had been associated with the University of Denver, and she was a musician, which is why the ceramic pot. But my father, she took a course in international relations from my father, and he persuaded her to become an international relations major. She then did her master's at Notre Dame and was back writing her PhD with my father when he died. So this African-American woman, music major from Alabama, wrote her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. And then in 1987, when I was helping Governor Michael Dukakis in his presidential race, and my job was to get foreign policy advisors, and I didn't know her. I thought, well, it's a woman, teaches on the West Coast, a Soviet expert, so I called her up, and I said, you know, this is what I'm doing, and Dr. Rice, would you like to be one of the advisors? And she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father.
I think we might have a couple of follow-up questions.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Albright. I was wondering, you were born in Czechoslovakia and spent several years abroad before you immigrated to the U.S. The U.S. president currently has to be born within the U.S. Do you think this is an antiquated concept?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, the reason that it's in the Constitution is because Alexander Hamilton was not born in the United States, and they didn't want him, or some people didn't want him. I think in many ways it is an antiquated concept. The only thing about it is the following, is I do think that it's not just a matter of people coming to the United States and becoming citizens, but I actually believe that it's very important, if you're going to be president of a country, to have spent a lot of time here and to have an American education. I think it makes a very big difference. And one of the very interesting parts is that as I was born in Czechoslovakia, and I'm sure that all of you have heard of Václav Havel, who was the president, and he and I were about the same age. And one of the things that happened was that I was on a trip there, and all of a sudden he says, well, I would like Secretary Albright to become the president of the Czech Republic, and I kind of, for which I was eligible if I had given up my American citizenship. But I basically said at that stage to them that I didn't, even though I spoke Czech and everything, that I didn't think it was right because I hadn't lived there a long time. And I do think that even with somebody like Václav Havel, and somebody that was a really brilliant defender of human rights, he had some quite different views about things because he hadn't been raised in the United States. And so I do think ultimately people that have lived here a long time and have an American education should be eligible. But it's a tough issue for people. And I think at the moment what we need to focus on is our immigration legislation to make sure that people that want to live here can, in fact, become American citizens. It's a very important part.
Well, Dr. Albright, what would you consider to be your greatest accomplishment during your tenure as Secretary of State? And considering you're currently promoting your pin collection, which pin would you say symbolizes that accomplishment?
Well, I loved being Secretary of State, I have to tell you. And You know, you work very, very hard. You try to solve a lot of different problems, and the problems in many ways are difficult. And they have no, I think the hardest part is that you don't often get to have something completely solved. People think you've accomplished and done something, but the story goes on. So in many ways, you manage things rather than just be able to put a check mark by something and say it's done. But my proudest thing that I did have to do with Kosovo. And life is very interesting in terms of just accidents and coincidence. As I mentioned, my father had been ambassador in Yugoslavia, and I was a little girl, but I certainly grew up understanding what Yugoslavia was about. In my flower delivery life, I gave flowers to Marshal Tito, and I really had a sense of the Balkans from my own background. So, passing strange that the part that I really had to work on a lot were the Balkans, Bosnia, and then Kosovo. And I was ambassador at the United Nations during the Bosnia time, and I felt that we had been much too slow doing something about it. And as U.S. ambassador to the UN, I saw more different diplomats than any other American diplomat. Whoever, you know, was ambassador to Germany would see more Germans or whatever, but basically I saw everybody. And they would come up and say, we expected the United States to do something about Bosnia, and you're not doing anything. And I would then come back to what are known as the principals meetings of the National Security Council to see what we could do. So it was much on my mind. And then when the ethnic cleansing began in Kosovo, I thought, well, now I'm Secretary of State, and I should be able to push or do something about it. And it was very interesting, and it's worth studying as a case study because it was very hard to persuade the rest of the American system about it. First of all, a lot of people could care less. You know, this was just some small place. How did it affect U.S. national interests? And the Secretary of State could say whatever, but we had no airplanes. And I began to think that we needed to do something more about it. And you kind of have asked about what influenced me in my background. I was born in Czechoslovakia, and my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. But Czechoslovakia was sold down the river, frankly, at the Munich Agreement in 1938, when the British and French didn't care about what was happening in some small country. And also, one could make the argument, I wouldn't, that we didn't know what was happening during World War II. And in the 90s, we knew everything that was going on everywhere. So should we do something about it? So it was an interesting bureaucratic exercise getting on to agree, and then going to the president. And the president agreed that we needed, after a lot of negotiation, to use force, air power, to stop the killing in Kosovo. So then what happened, we did that, and the other thing we had to do was to get international support for it. And we went to the United Nations, and it was very clear that the Russians were going to veto any UN mandate on it. So we then decided to go to NATO. And so it was very interesting doing the international negotiating on it and getting support for everything. And so that was an interesting case study. And then it really does sound antediluvian at this point, but I invented the idea of a diplomatic conference call. And I talked to most of the foreign ministers of NATO countries to get support all through the war on Kosovo. Then what happened is, because, as I said, the State Department had no airplanes, but what began, it began very, very badly. And the weather was bad. The Serbs put out decoys of a variety of kind. And then I came into my office one morning, and my executive assistant just flat out said, well, sit down. I said, what? He said, just sit down. He said, we have just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake. And the Chinese thought that we had been so proud of how accurate we were, and so the Chinese didn't believe that it was by mistake. And so one thing after another happened, and it took longer than we thought. But what has happened now is that there's a whole generation of little girls in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine, and they are very grateful for what we did. But back to the original point is it's not over. In Kosovo now, there are questions. It has declared its independence. We have recognized it. Some other countries haven't. And so I feel it's my best accomplishment, but it's not over. And I think that's another lesson, is that often these issues go on and need much longer term attention.
Dr. Albright, a lot of young people and students have become disenchanted with the history and the story of America and our role in the world. What would you have to say to young Americans about that?
Well, I would hope that they would go back and look at history and understand what America is about. Now, I may be absolutely the wrong person to ask, because people ask me what is the most important thing that ever happened in my life. It is becoming an American, hands down. And for me, the history of the United States is, it's interesting. People sometimes don't like the term that we're exceptional. I think America is exceptional. It is an exceptional country in terms of its birth, in terms of its composition, of its population, in terms of how we see our role in the world. I think the thing that makes people a little bit disillusioned is we are exceptional, but I don't think we can ask that exceptions be made for us. And I think people wonder what role we play, why we do certain things, and also whether we have any international responsibility. I think the hardest part is to explain to people, it's the job of the President of the United States to worry about the people, the territory, and our way of life. But since 9/11, we know that our territory is no longer protected by the oceans. Our people travel all over the world, and our way of life depends on having an interconnectedness with the rest of the world. And it means that we have to understand what America's role is. And when we were in office, President Clinton said it first, but I used the term so often that it became associated with me, which is that the U.S. is an indispensable nation. And I've already talked a little bit about World War II, but the story of my life is that the United States was not at Munich, and terrible things happened. The United States came into World War II, and everything changed. The United States, as a result of deals made during World War II, did not so-called liberate Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union did. And for 50 years, people lived behind the Iron Curtain. And then the Cold War ended, and an American example was there for the others. And so for me, the U.S. is indispensable. It has to be engaged. And I think we are a remarkable country. I think the only problem, and I always feel sorry when I say this, we are the most generous people in the world with the shortest attention span. And I think we are there in order to help either after a natural disaster or when one country is being invaded or subverted from inside. But as I said to you, the problems don't get solved. And I hope young Americans are not disillusioned. I think we have a remarkable history, but we also have a responsibility. And I think that we have to be able to operate in the 21st century in partnership with other countries. We do not have to do everything ourselves. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But it mostly means partnership and working with other countries. And I think that there is less disillusionment if we understand what our role is and how we operate with other countries. And that we have brave Americans such as you who are willing to go out and defend us.
Last question, Darris?
Yes, sir. Dr. Albright, I would just like to say that I remember as a young man actually watching you on television and speaking with my father about the things you were doing, and his great respect for you and your position was kind of embodied in me as well. And so I found it absolutely amazing meeting you here these past 2 days, how incredibly personable you are. and there's a real sense of a human element, and that is impressive for me. But something you talked about last night, I think it's very important. It was very encouraging that we heard last night, was your relationship with former secretaries of state and current secretaries of state, and how there seems to be this bipartisan relationship, that the mission is greater than the party. And if you could speak about that, I found that to be very encouraging about our current system.
Well, we do have a very interesting system of government, and other countries have many different parties. We mostly have two parties. And the interesting part is, I am obviously have been very political, but when I became Secretary of State, I said that all my partisan instincts were surgically removed. And you find that you have to work across the aisle on a set of issues in order to defend America and to be able to get our national interest. And so what happens, there's some very unlikely aspects, and I have to tell this story. When I was being confirmed, Jesse Helms, Republican from North Carolina, was in charge, and he called me up. Well, we'd first gotten to know each other when I was ambassador at the UN, and he called me up and asked me to come and speak at a college, a women's college in North Carolina, and I frankly thought I could get out of it by saying, if you come with me, I'll do it. And so he calls back and he says, yeah, I can do this. So when somebody invites you to speak, they usually don't introduce you as, you know, I've invited her, but she's really not I don't agree with anything she says, and I'm sorry she's here. So basically, he was very nice. And he then invited me to come to his college in Wingate. We drove all around North Carolina looking for barbecue places. And by the time we got there, he was basically bionic by then with two artificial hips, and I had to help him get out of the car. So there's this photograph of me hanging on to him, helping him get out of the car, and there were pictures of they started calling us the odd couple. The bottom line is, when I was about to become Secretary of State, he said, Ms. Madeleine, we're going to make history together. And we did, cooperated on the expansion of NATO and a whole host of other issues. Also, as Secretary of State, I had former Secretary Jim Baker invited me on my first foreign trip to Texas. And I went and I met the first President Bush, and we talked about a number of different policy issues, and it then became kind of my job to brief the former president. I did also President Ford, and I think that what you do is you realize how very, very difficult the jobs are, and how it is essential to understand what the national interest of your country is and try to sort it out. And when the former secretaries of state, they're now actually what we've been doing, and it was Secretary Schultz who thought this up, that it was a good idea for the former secretaries to give a dinner for the incumbent secretary. So we get together. Yesterday I talked to Secretary Clinton about what we would do for Secretary Kerry, and it's a very small club of people that have sat in the chair, that can exchange views and really help each other through problems. And I must say, as somebody, I worked for a Democratic senator for Ed Muskie. I've obviously worked for 2 Democratic presidents. But I do think that the bipartisan or nonpartisan cooperation is very important. And we've been delighted to be here for 2 days. Partially, you're all so nice. Washington is horrible at the moment. And I think that people are much more interested in their party affiliation. And I hope very much that in this second term, there really is a way that we can work together. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for those answers. Very insightful.
Thank you for your question.